The gun sight oil was freezing at 22,000 feet, and Lieutenant Tom Keller could see ice crystals forming on the inside of his canopy, despite the tropical sun burning through thin air over the Philippine Sea. He checked his instruments for the third time in as many minutes. Altimeter, fuel gauge, oil pressure, coolant temperature. The routine scan that kept pilots alive when everything else was trying to kill them. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine hummed with reassuring power beneath the long nose of his F6F Hellcat, 18 cylinders producing 2,000 horsepower, enough to push the fighter to 380 miles per hour in level flight. The sound was different from the older F4F Wildcats he'd flown at Midway, deeper, steadier, like the difference between a promising amateur and a seasoned professional. "Bandits, 11 o'clock high," the radio crackled with Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice, sharp with adrenaline but controlled. "Count 12, no 14, zeros in loose formation, Angels 24. Keller craned his neck left and up, squinting against the glare. There, tiny glints of metal catching sunlight, growing larger as his eyes focused. Japanese fighters descending from the northwest, probably launched from one of the carriers the task force had been hunting for 3 days. His grip tightened on the stick. This was it. His first engagement in the Hellcat after 6 weeks of carrier calls and formation flying. His first chance to test everything the briefing officers had told them about the new fighter. "All units, climbing starboard turn," Mitchell called. "Let's get some altitude. Stay in pairs." Keller's wingman, Ensign Bobby Chen from San Francisco, edged closer, his Hellcat tucking into position off Keller's right wing. Chen was 21, looked 17, and had never fired his guns at anything except towed sleeves during training. Keller was 23 and had 5 confirmed kills from Midway and the Coral Sea, back when American pilots flew Wildcats and died in staggering numbers trying to stop Japanese expansion. That felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than 2 years. The Hellcat's nose tilted up as Keller pulled back on the stick, the big fighter clawing for altitude with power the Zero pilots couldn't match. The R2800 didn't care about thin air at 24,000 feet. It just kept producing power, while the Japanese Sakai engines lost effectiveness with every 1,000 feet of altitude. Keller watched the altimeter wind upward. 23,000, 23,500, 24,000. The Zeros were at his altitude now, 2,000 yards distant and closing. He could see them clearly. The distinctive elliptical wings, the fixed landing gear fairings, the long greenhouse canopies. A6M Zero Sen fighters, the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific in 1942, that had massacred American bomber formations and outmaneuvered every fighter sent against them. Beautiful aircraft in their way, with a grace and agility that American fighters couldn't match. But beauty didn't matter when your Zero's 20mm cannons had half the ammunition capacity of a Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns. Beauty didn't matter when your Zero caught fire from a single burst because it had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no protection for the pilot. "Tally-ho!" Mitchell called. "Engaging!" The formation dissolved as both sides closed, the geometric precision breaking into the chaos of individual combat. Keller picked a Zero pulling into a climbing turn and pushed his throttle forward. The Hellcat surged, the acceleration pressing him back into his seat. 400 yards, 300. The Zero was turning hard right, trying to get into position for a deflection shot, but Keller had altitude and speed, and he used both, pulling into a high side run that put him on the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot saw him, reversed his turn with reflexes born from years of combat experience. The Zero flipped over and dove, pulling 6, maybe 7 Gs, trying to use his fighter's superior maneuverability to shake the American. Keller followed, the Hellcat's structure groaning under the strain but holding together because it was built like a tank, over-engineered and heavy in ways that would have horrified Japanese designers, but that kept American pilots alive. The Zero bottomed out at 18,000 feet and pulled up hard, trying to rope the Hellcat into a turning fight at low speed where Japanese fighters excelled. Keller didn't follow. He kept diving, building speed to 400 knots, then pulled up hard and climbed away. Energy fighting, the instructors called it. Use speed and altitude, never get slow, never turn with a zero. The Hellcat could absorb punishment and dish it out, but only if you fought it on your terms, not theirs. "Keller, brake right!" Chen's voice, high and tight with fear. Keller threw the stick right and saw tracers flash past his left wing, 20mm rounds from a Zero that had gotten on his tail while he'd been focused on the first target. The rounds sparkled as they passed, close enough to see individual projectiles tumbling through air. He kept the turn going, pulling 4 Gs, his vision narrowing to grey tunnel as blood drained from his head. The Zero stayed with him through the first 180 degrees, closing the distance, the Japanese pilot good enough to lead the turn and cut inside. This is how you die, Keller thought with sudden clarity. This is the moment where experience meets bad luck and you become a statistic. But Chen was there, his Hellcat diving from above, his 650 calibers opening up in a long burst that walked across the Zero's fuselage. Keller saw pieces fly off, fabric from the control surfaces, metal from the cowling, and then the Zero was burning, oil and fuel igniting in a sudden bloom of orange flame. The Japanese pilot didn't bail out. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he chose not to. The Zero rolled inverted and fell, trailing fire and black smoke. "Got him!" Chen's voice was shaking. "Jesus Christ, I got him!" "Good shooting," Keller managed, still recovering from the turn, his vision clearing. "Now, let's—" A Zero flashed past his nose, so close he could see the pilot's face through the canopy, young, pale, eyes wide with concentration. Keller didn't think, just reacted, pulling lead and firing. His 6 machine guns hammered, the recoil vibrating through the airframe, the gun camera filming everything for later analysis. Tracers reached out and touched the Zero's wing root. Fabric tore, fuel sprayed. The Zero nosed over and went down, but Keller didn't watch. Already he was scanning for the next threat, the next target, head on a swivel, because stopping to admire your work was how you died. The fight had scattered across 10 miles of sky, individual aircraft dueling while others tried to form up for coordinated attacks. Keller saw a Hellcat smoking badly, heading for the ocean with a Zero in pursuit. He saw 2 Zeros gang up on a single Hellcat, one attacking from each side in the classic bracket maneuver. He saw another Zero explode as a full deflection shot from Lieutenant Morrison caught its engine. The sky was full of smoke trails and falling aircraft and the bright flash of tracer fire. "All units, disengage and form up," Mitchell ordered. "We're Winchester on most birds. Return to base, bearing 185. Winchester, out of ammunition. Keller checked his own gun counters and saw he'd fired maybe 400 rounds, 20% of his load. Some pilots had been more aggressive or less accurate. But Mitchell was right. You didn't stay in a fight when half the formation was empty. You broke off, regrouped, lived to fight another day. The Hellcats formed up in loose combat spread, keeping enough distance to maneuver if more Zeros appeared. Keller counted 12 American fighters. They'd lost 2 in the engagement, Johnson and Richards, both of them seen going down smoking, no parachutes. The Zeros had lost at least 7 confirmed, maybe more in the confusion. A victory by any measure, but it didn't feel like victory when you were watching the ocean slide past below, knowing that somewhere down there your squadron mates were either dead or treading water, hoping for rescue before the sharks found them. The flight back to the carrier took 40 minutes, every one of them tense because Japanese submarines prowled these waters and a damaged aircraft was a tempting target. Keller kept his engine instruments in the green, nursing the Hellcat along, listening for any change in the R-2800's steady roar that might indicate battle damage he'd missed. But the fighter flew true, responding to control inputs with the solid feel that made you trust it, even when common sense said you shouldn't. USS Essex appeared on the horizon at 14:23 hours, her flight deck cleared for recovery, the deck crew ready to take the returning fighters. Keller circled once, checking his fuel, enough for 2 passes, maybe 3 if he was careful, then dropped into the landing pattern. The carrier grew larger in his windscreen. He lowered his tailhook, dropped flaps and gear, trimmed for approach speed. The deck was pitching in the swell, rising and falling through 10 feet of motion, the landing signal officer standing on the port-side platform with his paddles guiding each pilot home. The LSO gave him the cut signal, and Keller chopped throttle, let the Hellcat sink, felt the tailhook grab the number 3 wire with a jolt that threw him forward against his harness. Deck crew swarmed the aircraft immediately, unhooking the wire, directing him forward with hand signals, pushing another fighter into position for recovery. Keller taxied clear, shut down the engine, and sat in sudden silence punctuated only by the tick of cooling metal. His hands were shaking. He noticed it when he tried to unbuckle his harness and found his fingers wouldn't work properly. Reaction, the flight surgeon called it. Perfectly normal after combat. Your body flooding with adrenaline, and then having nowhere to put that energy when the threat ended. He forced his hands to steady, completed the post-flight checklist, and climbed down from the cockpit. The plane captain was already inspecting the Hellcat, making notes on his kneeboard. "Got some holes in the tail section, sir. Few dozen, maybe. Nothing structural. We'll have her patched and ready by morning." "Good." Keller's voice sounded strange to his own ears. Flat, emotionless. "She flew great. Took me home." "That's what they're built for, sir." The ready room was crowded with pilots being debriefed, the intelligence officers recording every detail of the engagement, number of enemy aircraft, types, tactics, results. Keller reported what he'd seen, described his kills, confirmed Chen's kill, and half a dozen others that multiple pilots had witnessed. The intelligence lieutenant wrote everything down in a leather-bound notebook, his pencil scratching across the page. "Any mechanical issues with the F6F?" the lieutenant asked. "None. She performed exactly as advertised." "And compared to the Zero?" Keller thought about it, trying to find words for something that existed more as feeling than fact. "The Zero's more agile at low speeds. If you get into a turning fight below 250 knots, he'll outturn you every time. But the Hellcat's faster, climbs better, dives better, and can take tremendous punishment. You fight it as an energy fighter. Use speed and altitude, make one high-speed pass, and disengage if you don't get a clean shot. Never slow down for a turning fight unless you've got a wingman covering you." "And the armament?" 650s are perfect. Range is good, hitting power is excellent, and we carry enough ammunition to engage multiple targets. The Zero's 20mm cannons hit harder, but they don't carry many rounds. We can afford to hose down the target area. They have to make every shot count." The lieutenant made more notes, then moved on to interview Chen, who was describing his first kill with hand gestures and breathless excitement that made him look even younger than his 21 years. Keller watched him for a moment, remembering what it felt like to get your first kill. The exhilaration, the relief, the horror when you realized you'd just killed another human being who'd probably been exactly like you, just wearing a different uniform and flying a different flag. That night, Keller wrote letters in the small stateroom he shared with 3 other pilots. One to Johnson's wife, trying to explain that her husband had died quickly and hadn't suffered, which was probably a lie, but the only kindness he could offer. One to Richard's parents, saying their son had been brave and skilled, and the squadron would miss him, which was true enough to ease his conscience. And one to his own mother in Pennsylvania, telling her he was fine, and the food was good, and he'd received her last letter with the news about his sister's engagement. He didn't mention the combat, didn't describe the Zeros burning, or the men dying, or the way his hands had shaken after landing. Some truths were too heavy to share with people who couldn't possibly understand them. The mission tempo increased over the following weeks as the American fleet pushed westward toward the Philippines. Keller flew 2 or 3 missions per day. Combat air patrol over the fleet, fighter sweeps against Japanese airfields, escort for bombing strikes against enemy installations. The Hellcat proved itself again and again, its rugged construction and overwhelming firepower negating the Zero's advantages in agility and range. He shot down his 6th Zero on June 15th during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. the massive carrier engagement that the pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because the Japanese lost over 300 aircraft while the Americans lost fewer than 30. The sky that day was full of Japanese planes, Zeros, Vals, Kates, entire formations coming in at different altitudes, all of them attacking the American carriers with desperate courage and no coordination. The Hellcats massacred them. Keller got his Zero at 14,000 feet, catching it in a climbing turn, firing a 2-second burst that set the fuel tanks ablaze. The Japanese pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just as the Zero exploded below him. Keller watched him drift down toward the ocean and wondered if anyone would pick him up, if he'd survived to sit in a POW camp until the war ended, or if he'd just disappear into the vast Pacific. His 7th kill came 10 minutes later, another Zero trying to attack a crippled Hellcat, so focused on his target he didn't see Keller diving from above. The burst caught him in the cockpit. The Zero rolled over and went straight down with no pilot at the controls. 8 and 9 came the next day during another strike, both Zeros jumping his formation as they escorted bombers to a target on Guam. He got them both in the same engagement, using the Hellcat's speed to disengage after the first kill and reposition for a high side attack on the second. Chen got one too, his 3rd kill, making him an ace if the ship's confirmation board approved the claim. 10 came on June 20th during the twilight recovery that nearly ended in disaster when the fleet ran low on fuel, and Admiral Mitcher ordered all ships to turn on their lights despite the submarine threat, guiding his pilots home through darkness. Keller shot the Zero down at sunset, its wings catching the last light as it fell, beautiful and deadly right up to the moment it hit the water. By July, he'd stopped counting. The kills blurred together into a sequence of deflection shots and lead angles and the constant scan for threats. He'd become what the Navy needed him to be, an efficient killer of Japanese aircraft, a machine that converted flight time and ammunition into enemy casualties. The transformation bothered him less than he'd expected. You adapted or you died, and he'd chosen to adapt. The squadron held a ceremony on July the 4th, awarding medals and promotions on Essex's flight deck while the ship steamed toward Iwo Jima. Keller received a Distinguished Flying Cross for actions during the Philippine Sea Battle. Chen got an Air Medal. Mitchell, the squadron commander, got promoted to full commander and given another squadron. His replacement was a Naval Academy graduate named Peterson, who'd flown F-4U Corsairs off land bases and approached carrier operations with textbook precision that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. "The F6F is a good aircraft," Peterson told the assembled pilots during his first briefing, "but it's not invincible. We're seeing improved Japanese tactics, coordinated attacks, better use of altitude advantage, more aggressive defensive flying. They're learning from their mistakes. We need to learn faster." He was right. The Japanese were changing tactics, accepting casualties they couldn't afford in exchange for lessons they desperately needed. The quality of their pilots was declining. Too many experienced aviators dead, too few training hours for replacements. But their courage never wavered. They came at the American formations with determination that bordered on suicidal, accepting 10-to-1 loss ratios because losing slowly was better than not fighting at all. Keller shot down his 15th Zero on August 3rd over Formosa. His 16th came 2 days later during a strike on Okinawa. 17 through 20 came in a single engagement on August 15th, when his division intercepted a large formation of Japanese bombers and fighters attempting to attack the fleet. He got 4 Zeros in 12 minutes, using hit-and-run tactics that the Hellcat excelled at, each pass resulting in a kill before he could disengage and reposition. The squadron intelligence officer told him he was now the 5th-ranking ace in the fleet, with 20 confirmed kills and 8 probables. The number meant nothing. It was just arithmetic, a tally that didn't capture what each kill represented: the fear before engagement, the concentration during combat, the relief after survival. Numbers couldn't explain the weight of killing, the way it accumulated in your mind, like sediment in a river, slowly building until one day you looked at yourself and wondered who you'd become. September brought a rotation back to Pearl Harbor for rest and refit. The squadron flew off Essex and landed at Barber's Point Naval Air Station, transitioning from carrier operations to shore-based flying while the ship underwent maintenance. The break should have been welcome, but Keller found himself restless without the routine of daily missions, without the immediate purpose that combat provided. He spent the time writing letters, sleeping 14 hours a day, drinking at the officers' club with other pilots who'd survived long enough to earn shore leave. They didn't talk about combat much. What was there to say? They'd all seen the same things, done the same things, carried the same memories. The silence between them was more eloquent than words. Chen received orders transferring him to the new carrier Franklin as part of an experienced pilot cadre to train their air group. They said goodbye on the flight line, shaking hands awkwardly, neither man sure what to say. "Keep your head on a swivel," Keller told him finally, "and never turn with a zero." "I know. You taught me that." "Then teach someone else. Keep them alive." Chen nodded, picked up his sea bag, walked toward the waiting transport. Keller watched him go and felt something break loose inside, some connection to the person he'd been before the war. Chen had been his wingman for 4 months, had saved his life that first day, had learned from him and grown into a competent fighter pilot. Now he was gone, off to another ship, another squadron, another set of missions that would probably kill him eventually, because that's what happened in war. You survived until you didn't, and the only variable was timing. Essex returned to combat operations in October, rejoining the fleet for strikes against Formosa and the Philippines in preparation for MacArthur's return. The air war had intensified, Japanese resistance growing more desperate as American forces closed on their home islands. Kamikaze attacks began appearing with increasing frequency, aircraft loaded with explosives, flown by pilots with no intention of returning, targeting the carriers that represented American naval power. Keller shot down his first kamikaze on October 25th during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was a Zero modified for suicide attack, stripped of unnecessary equipment, carrying a 250-kilogram bomb under the fuselage. The pilot was flying straight and level toward Essex, ignoring the fighters trying to intercept him, focused entirely on his target. Keller got him at 1,000 yards, a deflection shot that hit the engine and sent the Zero spinning into the ocean. The bomb detonated on impact, sending up a waterspout visible for miles. "Good kill," Peterson's voice on the radio. "But there are more coming. Stay alert." 3 more kamikazes attacked over the next 20 minutes. Keller got one, missed the second, watched the third get through the combat air patrol, and hit the destroyer escort USS Shelton, punching through the thin deck armor and exploding inside the ship. Shelton burned for 3 hours before her crew abandoned ship, and the destroyers finished her with torpedoes. The kamikaze threat changed everything. You couldn't reason with a pilot who'd already accepted death, couldn't intimidate someone who wanted to die, taking you with him. The only defense was to kill them before they reached the fleet, which meant fighters had to be more aggressive, take more risks, accept casualties to protect the ships. Keller shot down 5 more kamikazes over the next 3 weeks. Each one felt different from regular combat, less like warfare and more like execution. The kamikaze pilots flew poorly, their training minimal, their tactics non-existent. But their determination made them dangerous. A well-trained fighter pilot you could outfly, outshoot, outlast. A kamikaze just had to hit you once. His 28th kill came on November 13th, a Zero that tried to kamikaze Essex during a dawn attack. Keller was on combat air patrol when the bogey appeared on radar, coming in low and fast from the north. He dove to intercept, caught the Zero at 500 feet, fired a burst that set it ablaze. The Japanese pilot tried to turn toward the carrier anyway, flying a burning aircraft through sheer will until a second burst from Keller's guns sent it cartwheeling into the sea. "Splash 1, he reported, his voice mechanical. "Good shooting," the fighter direction officer replied. "Return to cap station." Keller climbed back to altitude and resumed his patrol pattern, scanning the horizon for more threats. The sun was rising now, turning the ocean gold and pink, beautiful in ways that felt wrong during war. How could the world be so lovely when men were dying, when pilots were deliberately crashing their aircraft into ships, when entire fleets were trying to kill each other with mechanical efficiency? There was no answer. There never was. December brought a typhoon that scattered the fleet and forced Essex to ride out 100-foot swells while securing everything on deck with extra chains and cables. 3 destroyers were lost, overwhelmed by waves that simply swallowed them. The carrier survived but took damage, bent metal and sprung seams that required 2 weeks in port for repairs. Keller spent the time in the Philippines, based at a forward airstrip that had been coral and jungle 6 months earlier, and was now a functioning naval air station. He flew patrols, escorted supply convoys, shot down his 30th and 31st Zeros during an engagement over Manila Bay. The kills felt routine by now, mechanical steps in a process he'd repeated so many times that muscle memory took over before conscious thought engaged. "You need a break," the squadron flight surgeon told him during a routine physical. "You're showing signs of combat fatigue. Slowed reaction times, difficulty sleeping, emotional flatness." "I sleep fine." "How many nightmares per night?" Keller didn't answer. The flight surgeon made a note on his clipboard. "I'm recommending you for rotations stateside. Instructor duty, maybe test pilot work. You've done your part here. The war's not over. It will be, and you've earned the right to see it end from somewhere other than a cockpit." The orders came through in January 1945, transferring him to Naval Air Station Jacksonville for fighter tactics instruction. He left the squadron in February, flying a war-weary Hellcat to Guam and then catching a transport to Hawaii and finally California. By March, he was teaching new pilots the lessons he'd learned in 200 combat missions: energy fighting, mutual support, disciplined aggression. The students were young and eager and terrified, just like he'd been 2 years earlier when the war was new and death was an abstract concept. He heard about Chen in April. The carrier Franklin had been hit by 2 bombs during operations off Okinawa, the resulting fires killing over 700 men. Chen had been in his cockpit preparing for launch when the bombs hit. His body was never recovered. The news arrived as a telegram forwarded from Chen's family, who'd gotten Keller's name from their son's letters. They wanted to know what Bobby had been like as a pilot, whether he'd been good at it, whether his death had meant anything. Keller wrote back with lies that were also truths. Chen had been brave and skilled, and had died fighting for his country, and his memory would live on in the pilots he'd inspired. He didn't mention how young Chen had looked that first day, how scared he'd been, how his hands had shaken after his first kill. He didn't mention that Bobby's death probably meant nothing except another statistic in a war full of statistics. Another bright young life ended too soon for reasons that would become less clear as time passed. Some truths were too cruel to share. The war ended in August. Atomic bombs and Soviet invasion and Japanese surrender all coming within days of each other. Keller was still at Jacksonville when the announcement came through, still teaching young pilots who would now never have to test their skills in combat. They celebrated in the officers' club, drinking and laughing and promising to stay in touch. But Keller felt disconnected from it all, watching from outside a bubble that separated him from people who hadn't done what he'd done, seen what he'd seen. He stayed in the Navy until 1947, then resigned his commission and went back to school on the GI Bill, studying engineering at Northwestern. He married in 1949, had 2 kids, worked for Boeing designing aircraft systems, lived a quiet suburban life that bore no resemblance to those 20 months when he'd been a fighter pilot hunting Japanese aircraft over the Pacific. The nightmares never completely stopped. Once or twice a month he'd wake at 0300 hours, his heart racing, the sound of machine guns echoing in his mind. His wife learned not to wake him during these episodes, just to wait until he came back from whatever dark place he'd visited. They never discussed it. What could she say that would help? What could he explain that she'd understand? In 1973, a documentary crew tracked him down, wanting to interview World War II aces for a film about carrier aviation. Keller agreed reluctantly, sat in front of the camera, and tried to answer their questions. "What was it like flying the F6F Hellcat?" the director asked. Keller thought about it, searching for words that could bridge the gap between experience and understanding. "It was like driving a truck that could fight. The Hellcat wasn't graceful like the Zero or beautiful like the Corsair. It was just solid, dependable. You climbed in knowing that if you did your job right, it would bring you home. That confidence changed everything. You could be aggressive because you trusted the aircraft to survive the enemy's response. You could press attacks because you knew the Hellcat would protect you, and you could make mistakes because it forgave errors that would kill you in other fighters. And the Zero? The Zero was everything the Hellcat wasn't. Light, agile, graceful. In the hands of an experienced pilot it was deadly, but by 1944 most of their experienced pilots were dead and the replacements didn't have enough training. The Hellcat exploited that gap. It was designed for the war we were fighting, not the war the Japanese had trained for. Any regrets? The question hung in the air. Keller thought about 31 confirmed kills, about Chen and Johnson and Richards and all the other pilots who hadn't come back, about the Japanese aviators who died in burning aircraft, their names unknown, but their humanity undeniable. "No regrets about flying," he said finally, "but I wish the war hadn't been necessary. I wish all those men, ours and theirs, had lived. I wish skill at killing hadn't become my defining characteristic. But regrets don't change anything. You do what you have to do, you live with the consequences, and you try to find meaning in survival." He died in 2003, 79 years old, survived by his wife, 2 children, and 5 grandchildren. The funeral was small, attended by family, and a handful of old squadron mates who'd somehow stayed in touch across 6 decades. They told stories about missions and near misses, and the time Keller had landed on the wrong carrier and didn't realize it until the deck crew pointed it out. They laughed at memories polished smooth by time, the edges of horror worn down to anecdotes. No one mentioned the men who'd died. No one counted the kills. The stories they told were about camaraderie and youth, and the strange days when they'd been young men doing impossible things because someone had to do them. At the graveside, the colour guard fired a 3-volley salute that echoed across Arlington National Cemetery. A bugler played taps. The flag was folded and presented to his widow, who accepted it with hands that were steady despite her tears. Later, someone placed a model F6F Hellcat on the grave marker, the aircraft painted in the markings of VF-15, Keller's squadron. It stayed there through one winter before disappearing, taken by a souvenir hunter or blown away by wind. The grave remained, another white headstone among thousands, marking a man who'd done his duty and survived and tried to live a good life afterward. In museums and air shows and grainy documentary footage, F6F Hellcats still fly, their distinctive profile recognizable to anyone who knows aviation history. The survivors are maintained by dedicated volunteers, flown by pilots who never knew combat, but who honor the men who did. The aircraft are beautiful in their obsolescence, reminders of a time when technology and courage combined to turn the tide of history. But the men who flew them in anger are gone now, every one of them dead, their memories fading into history's vast archive. The stories remain, some true, some embellished, all of them incomplete, because words can never fully capture what it meant to climb into a fighter at dawn and fly into combat, knowing you might not return. The Hellcat dominated the Zero not through any single advantage, but through accumulated margins, better armor, more firepower, superior tactics, adequate pilot training. It was an engineer's solution to a warrior's problem, using American industrial might and systematic thinking to overcome Japanese innovation and fighting spirit. In the end, 305 Hellcat pilots became aces, shooting down 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing 270 F6Fs in air combat. The math was brutal but decisive, a kill ratio of 19-1 that broke Japanese naval aviation beyond repair. But each number represented a human being who'd woken up that morning and gone to war and never returned. Some were heroes. Some were just unlucky. All of them believed they were fighting for something worth dying for. The sky remembers them. It always has.